So isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
Okay, all right. For this week's guest, we have returning to the show Scott Ritter. He is a former Marine Corps intelligence officer and former UN weapons inspector, author of many books, including his latest, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. And Scott has a lot to say, as always, about the proxy war in Ukraine. We're going to talk about the Wagner rebellion, Ukraine's counteroffensive, and how possibly this horrible disaster could end. So let's go to Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The big news of the week is this failed revolt, protest, whatever you want to call it, in Russia by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the mercenary Wagner force. Now, the dominant line we got initially was that this is going to turn into a civil war in Russia. Lots of Russians are going to be killed. That was promoted by the likes of Michael McFaul and Anne Applebaum. After the revolt was quickly put down and not even a single shot was fired on Moscow, the new narrative became, okay, Putin avoided a coup, but he's considerably weaker as a result. What do you make of what happened and this narrative that we're getting in the West, that Putin is permanently damaged as a result of this?
Well, I think I'll contradict McFaul on both counts. We were extraordinarily dangerous, we being the world. And I think we have to understand this isn't just an internal Russian issue. This is an issue of global importance. Let's just set the stage for a second. Russia is a nuclear power engaged in an existential war, a war it has defined as of existential nature against the collective West. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of a rogue mercenary army that Russian intelligence believes, whom Russian intelligence believes has been actively conspiring with Ukrainian intelligence since at least January of this year, is now leading a march on Moscow, the goal of which is to overthrow the government of Russia. People can say, well, he never threatened Putin. He did actually threaten Putin. First of all, when you say I'm coming in to get rid of your defense minister and the chief of staff of your armed forces, you're saying I'm coming after you. And then after Putin didn't roll over, he said, yeah, you're done too. So, no, this was an armed coup designed to topple Vladimir Putin, the leader of a nuclear armed state engaged in an existential struggle for its survival with the collective West, the intelligence services of which might be controlling Prigozhin. So let's just get the record straight here. So there was a chance for not only real violence, and there was violence. People tend to forget that numerous helicopters and one fixed-wing aircraft were shot down by the Wagner forces, killing 10 to 12 airmen. And the Russian helicopters, military helicopters, did fire on the Wagner column, killing 2 Wagner soldiers and wounding 3. So there was violence. It's not like there was no violence. And there was the potential for great violence. As Wagner rolled towards Moscow, Putin, in addition to having Lukashenko make a phone call, find a peaceful end to this, mobilized 2,500 of Russia's best special operations forces, who were deployed in the fields in Serpukhov, a city south of Moscow. They were deployed to receive an assault. That means they were ready for war. And they were backed by 10,000 Russian National Guardsmen with heavy equipment behind them, who were there to reinforce, outflank, and mop up whatever was left of Wagner. Meanwhile, down in Rostov, where Yevgeny Prigozhin had seized the commander of the headquarters of the Southern Military District, responsible for overseeing the special military operation. So again, let's just understand. Prigozhin seized the headquarters responsible for overseeing Russian military operations in an active war zone in the midst of a Ukrainian offensive. Nice guy. 10,000 Chechen Akhmat special forces had been mobilized and had surrounded Rostov. And the signal had been sent to Prigozhin, we're coming for you, we're going to kill you as only Chechens can. Now, they didn't say that. That's what they meant. The Chechens posted video saying, we're here in Rostov. We don't know what's going on. It's crazy, but we've got our orders and we are going to execute our orders. So Prigozhin was suddenly confronted with the fact that he and all of his men were about to die. Because that's what would have happened had Putin said, pull the trigger, boys, pull the trigger. But the sad thing is that thousands of Russian soldiers would die. And because you're talking about combat operations in an environment where there are civilians, the potential for hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians would die. And once you have people dying, the potential for emotions to become inflamed becomes real. At the same time Prigozhin was doing this, the Ukrainian intelligence services were seeking to implement an operation in Moscow coordinated with the movement of Prigozhin's forces that would have had subversive elements blow up, set off explosives amongst civilian targets, creating a sense of terror, of fright. As Prigozhin was advancing, phone calls and internet messages were being sent to Russian civilians saying, Wagner will save you. Gather in, I think it's Manajna Square. What were they seeking? A new Moscow Maidan, to get civilians to gather in the square, protesting against Putin, praising Wagner, praising Prigozhin. This is the coup. This is real, guys. This isn't fake. It ended because Putin is a strong leader. Prigozhin had been carrying out a propaganda campaign since at least January that targeted Shoigu and Gerasimov and Putin indirectly. It was a campaign designed to win over the hearts and minds of not only the Russian people, but the Russian oligarchs, Russian generals. He was saying the generals are weak. We need real soldiers, real leaders, real men to come in and finish this job. He was led to believe by Ukrainian intelligence that as he moved on Moscow, people would rally around him, that generals would defect over to his cause, bringing soldiers over. And you saw early postings where Prigozhin had photographs that had nothing to do with reality, but you saw the photographs of Russian soldiers with no weapons saying the border guards have put down their arms and welcomed Wagner forces with open arms. It wasn't true, but they're trying to create this perception of surrender. It didn't happen. Nobody defected. Not a single person defected. Everybody rallied around Vladimir Putin. So Mr. McFall, Ann Applebaum, and everybody else, you don't know what you're talking about. We came very close to a nuclear war. Let me tell you why. Because had there been a civil war, Russia would have had to put its nuclear forces on full alert, because you have a coup happening at a time when the Russian intelligence services are briefing Putin that this is orchestrated by American forces, British forces, etc. They're trying to create this. There could have been uncertainty. There could have been panic. Who knows? There could have been a nuclear war. So it's not a game, guys. This was dangerous. The question I have for Putin or for Biden is the following: you claim you did nothing because you didn't want the Russians to think that you were involved. And yet you also claim that you were very worried about the security of Russia's nuclear weapons. Well, which is it, pal? Were you worried about the security of Russia's nuclear weapons, or did you not want to be involved? Because let me put it this way. Many times the United States calls up their Russian counterparts and says, hey, there's a terrorist cell operating in St. Petersburg getting ready to blow up a device. And the Russian forces go, thank you very much. They go in and they disrupt it because we had that kind of cooperation. So if we're willing to stop a terrorist from blowing up an explosive device in St. Petersburg, and this is a statement of fact, it actually happened, why aren't we willing to call up and say, hey, Vlad, Prigozhin's getting ready to make a move to overthrow you. We're concerned that, A, you might think it's us, it's not, and B, we think that he might be targeting a nuclear storage facility that's located around Voronezh, and we want to give you a heads up so you can take the appropriate measures. Why didn't we do that? Because we didn't want to stop Prigozhin, because we were hoping that Prigozhin would start a civil war that would prompt forces to be withdrawn, etc. This was a very, very dangerous thing. Putin is stronger than ever, but I have to tell you, if you're Russian, you can't be proud of this. This is not a good look. This is Banana Republic type look, especially given that Russia just had a wonderful moment at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum where they demonstrated to the world that they have defeated sanctions once and for all, that the Russian economy is churning ahead full speed, the strongest economy in the history of Russia. And then they have this.
The part that I have a hard time getting my head around is this notion that Prigozhin could have been working with Ukrainian and Western intelligence. And I realized even before all this happened, there were these Pentagon leaks saying that Prigozhin offered Ukraine the coordinates of Russian forces. But that, I found hard to believe just based on the fact that Prigozhin, I don't think, or Ukraine wouldn't need Prigozhin to tell them where Russian forces are, because I presume that the U.S. is already giving them those coordinates. So what use could Prigozhin provide there? And meanwhile, he is leading the force that killed thousands of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. And his criticism all along was that Russia wasn't being aggressive enough inside Ukraine, and that's his main criticism of these Russian leaders. And so, and that he wanted more support. And meanwhile, you do have this looming deadline where Wagner was going to be subsumed by the Russian military, forced to sign contracts with the Russian military, which would have sidelined him. So to me, the official story that he was just angry about that and was trying to basically force Russia's military leadership to back down and let him keep his little mercenary force, and force Russia's military to be even more aggressive in Ukraine. That to me seems more plausible than this notion he was working with Ukraine and Western intelligence.
Well, why can't both be true? And let me tell you why I believe both are true. Russia is a nation that's based upon the rule of law. I know Anna Applebaum will freak out and say, no, 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 Putin's a dictator and there's no law in Russia, but it's actually a nation fully governed by the rule of law. And there's a couple of laws in place here. One, basic contract law. The Russian government had signed a one-year contract on 1 May 2022 with Yevgeny Prigozhin, providing him with $940 million to create a combat force of contract soldiers who worked for the Wagner Group, not for the Russian Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin executed that contract. He made a lot of money doing it. $940 million, of course, a lot of it goes to building this force. But understand that one of the first things that Wagner did, that Prigozhin did, once it became clear that the fighting was extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily bloody, was to talk to his commanders. He said, we have these elite guys that we've recruited, and they're dying by the bushelful. And it's going to be very expensive for me to go out and recruit new ones. How do we solve this problem? And they said, well, half the problem is the initial phase of the battle where we have to aggressively push forward under fire. We're going to lose a lot of guys there, but we don't really need the most skilled people in the world. And so Prigozhin went, why don't I go to the prisons and recruit prisoners? Which he did. Estimates are between 30 and 50,000 inmates were ultimately recruited by Wagner. 21 days of training. Anybody who says that every Wagner fighter is an elite fighter, you have no clue what elite means. 21 days of training does not produce an elite fighter. It does produce somebody who has basic skills who can be an elite fighter implementing these tactics. It's interesting how Prigozhin saying Shoigu and Gerasimov are responsible for the deaths of thousands of Russians, that irresponsible, bad tactics. I could do a better job. Just time out, people. Shoigu and Gerasimov are responsible for the current state of Russian defenses. In the first 3 weeks of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, 13,000 Ukrainians died. Vladimir Putin says that the kill ratio is 10-1. That means 1,300 Russians have died. That's a big number, by the way. But 13,000 Ukrainians have died. In the battle for Bakhmut, using these tactics that Prigozhin used, the prisoner tactics, they killed 75,000 Ukrainians, but they lost 30,000 Russians. Now, I'm a simple Marine, but that's basically a 2-to-1 kill ratio. So if you're going to be Prigozhin and try and make the argument that my approach is better in terms of preserving Russian life, how do you do that? You can't. You can't square the two. This has nothing to do about tactics and everything. Prigozhin made a business decision to bring in the prisoners. He slaughtered them. He sacrificed them. He threw them into the meat grinder to achieve a victory on the battlefield. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second. But he did so with total disregard for human life. So the notion that Prigozhin, some sort of genius military man who cares about the lives of Russians, is absurd. He threw them away. He sacrificed them. He ground them up in the meat grinder. Now let's ask why he did this. You see, it was a business decision. He started recruiting them to make money. He's making a lot of money, by the way, because the cost of an inmate, both in terms of your salary, you don't have to pay him as much, but you've been budgeted for a full-scale Wagner guy, now you're paying for an inmate. And when they die, you don't have to pay the reparations. They're inmates. They go in the ground. That's it. Nobody gets paid. So you're making tens of millions of dollars that are going into your pockets. Good business deal for Prigozhin. And remember, he's a businessman. He has no military experience whatsoever. A businessman. Now, and I also understand, he didn't want anybody to know. Nobody talked about Wagner up until a certain point. If you remember, Bellingcat wrote some articles that said Prigozhin was associated with Wagner, and he sued them for defamation, saying, "How dare you say I'm a member of Wagner, I'm associated with Wagner." But then something happened. You see, Wagner exists in the Donbass because it's not Russian soil. Wagner can get away with creating this unit on the Donbass soil as long as it was the independent soil of Lugansk and Donetsk. But in September of 2022, there was a referendum, and the Donbass became Russia. And the second that happened, Wagner had a problem because, legally speaking, they can't operate on Russian soil. There's no Russian law that permits a private military contractor having a private army operating on Russian soil. Now, Prigozhin had a one-year contract, and because contract law is everything, it was agreed that this contract would be played out. But at the end of the contract, Wagner had to convert to a volunteer unit within the Ministry of Defense, which means Prigozhin loses his money-making abilities. One of the problems that Prigozhin was running into is he couldn't recruit prisoners anymore because the prisoner, in order to have the contract with the Russian government, needs a full 6-month term. And if Wagner's term is going to run out on 1 May 2023, that means the last prisoner intake you could take is 1 December. And so he can't recruit prisoners anymore, so now he's got a problem. He's got to throw his boys into the fighting. The other problem he has is he has to win the hearts and minds of people. Notice when he came out. September 25th is when the referendum took place in Lugansk. September 26th is when Prigozhin issued his telegram interview saying, "Yeah, by the way, I'm the head of Wagner." Why did he do that? Because he knew he had a PR problem. He knew that if he left it, he would lose Wagner, lose his money. So he started saying, "I'm the head of Wagner." Then he started saying, "Look how great Wagner is." He started attacking Shoigu and Gerasimov, criticizing them. The battle for Bakhmut should not have been fought. Wagner had just back in I think in March, April, Wagner had a great victory in Soledar, the neighboring city. At that point in time, the Russian military wanted to pause, stop. They didn't see a need to go into Bakhmut because it had no strategic value whatsoever. It's there. Let the Ukrainians be dug in. We'll just pound them with artillery. But Prigozhin had to create the perception of the invincibility, of the almighty purpose of Wagner. So he created the meat grinder. He started this operation to inflict casualties on the Ukrainians, but in doing so, he threw away the lives of 30,000 inmates, 20,000 inmates, 10,000 of his own people, threw them into the meat grinder. But that's all anybody talked about now. It seized the headlines. The meat grinder, Wagner leading the fight, Wagner, the heroes of Russia. And that's all everybody talked about. And then when the battle ended, what did Prigozhin do? Threw a temper tantrum, shouted at Shoigu, and why? Because all of his plans were to no, didn't reach any fruition. Shoigu said, "Hey, good job. But by the way, we told you not to fight this fight. You were supposed to be done by 1 May. You entered Bakhmut and kept this battle going for 20 additional days because you want a contract. You want to violate the law. You want to violate what we've said. Ain't going to happen. We give you a 2-month extension. Get your troops out of Bakhmut, settle down in Lugansk, and be prepared to transfer over." And that's when Prigozhin went over there and started stewing. He had relationships with Ukrainian intelligence. It's not just the story about the coordinates. I don't believe that story either. That makes no sense. But we know that he was in contact with Ukrainian intelligence in Africa, and we know that they had ongoing relationships. One of the ways we know about this is look at how Zelensky responded when the Washington Post confronted him with that. He didn't respond by, rumors, speculation. He was like, "How do you know this? Where's your source? This is treason. Whoever talked to you is treasonous." I mean, Zelensky is panicking as he's told this. And it was a SIGINT source. The Americans were listening to Ukrainians talking about, it wasn't about coordination or coordinates. It was about Wagner seeking to overthrow or put a coup d'etat in Moldova. So it's there. There's other evidence that indicates that Wagner was in contact with the Ukrainians. And believe me, if you're in contact with the Ukrainians, that means that you're at least indirectly in contact with MI6 and the CIA. So there's an intelligence aspect here that the Russians are aware of. Lavrov's hinted at it. He said there will be an investigation into this. Why bring it up if it doesn't exist? So I think that Prigozhin was basically a businessman who lost his billion-dollar deal and who was turning to foreign sources to assist in facilitating a coup d'etat that would topple Putin, put him in power, and he would be able to stay in power by saying, I can get sanctions lifted, I can bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Because look at what he said before he went in. He spouted all Ukrainian talking points. We shouldn't have gone to war to begin with. We went to war on a lie. This is all about, the empowerment of the Russian elite. This is a war that doesn't need to be fought. He's saying all that. Why? So he can be the peacemaker?
Quick follow up, Scott. Um, it's one thing to commit a failed mutiny. It's another thing to commit treason. And so, if indeed Prigozhin, as you suspect, did work with Western and Ukrainian intelligence, how does Putin let him live?
Putin promised him amnesty for the mutiny
Yeah.
and sent him to Belarus. Putin didn't. I call this the Al Capone effect. Al Capone was a murderer, committed a lot of crimes. He went to jail for tax evasion. Okay, Prigozhin committed treason. An armed insurrection is the living embodiment of treason, and Putin has pardoned him for that sin. Go forth, go to Belarus, and sin no more. But when he announced, it's amazing because Putin came out and he basically said, "Yeah, by the way, we had a contract with Wagner, $940 million. Oh, and we gave Prigozhin a sweetheart deal too, a 1-year contract, it's concurrent, worth $900 million to provide food to the Russian army. Now we don't know if it was spent right, if they walked away with it, but we're going to look at that. And I'm telling you right now that Prigozhin is a crook, a criminal, and the Russians are going to uncover massive corruption on his part, and he will be prosecuted for those crimes. The other thing is, if they find the proof that he was actively colluding with foreign intelligence services, that's a different crime. He only got pardoned for one crime, taking troops in. The other crimes, he's still susceptible for, and he's under house arrest equivalent in Belarus, where he can't run away. So no, he's dead man walking. His days are numbered. They needed to get him out of the situation so that the Wagner troops would peacefully disperse, because he did build up this cult of personality. The loyalty of the Wagner people to Prigozhin is real. It's genuine. But notice this: of the 25,000 Wagner soldiers, only 8,000 followed him into Russia proper. The remaining 17,000 stayed in their camps in Lugansk because they said, we're not going to be a party to this.
And Lukashenko, now the prime minister of Belarus, is saying that he brokered this deal that Putin wanted to eliminate Prigozhin and attack Wagner. And he convinced him not to do this. Do you think that's true?
I don't think that Vladimir Putin is somebody who is swayed. I think that Vladimir Putin said, um, if Prigozhin doesn't stop, I'm going to kill everybody. That's just the way it's going to be. And Lukashenko said, well, I know Prigozhin. And Putin's like, and well, I can call Prigozhin. And I maybe can get Prigozhin to stop. And why are you talking to me? Because I'm telling you right now, if he doesn't turn around, I'm going to kill him. Lukashenko wouldn't have made that call unless Putin said, make that call. So Lukashenko can take all the credit he wants. He deserves credit for brokering this thing, but let's not pretend for a second that this is Vladimir Putin sitting there saying, I'm going to kill him. And Lukashenko's calling up going, hey, boss, I could cut a deal. I'm a peacemaker. I'm a good guy. This is the other way around, where Putin is telling Lukashenko, if you have any pull with this guy, you better call him right now, because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to kill everybody.
Can you talk more about what you think Prigozhin was expecting to happen and hoping to happen?
Sure. Again, now, Aaron, I know you're the professional journalist, and we're going to delve into the realm of speculation, and that's always dangerous in journalism. But I'm just being upfront about it. Everything we've talked about so far, I feel comfortable that I can put to a point and say this is it. But now we're getting into the darker world of speculation. But this is speculation. I'll call it informed speculation, because I'm going to be talking about MI6 and how they handle human sources. And I do have direct experience in that, dating back to my Iraq days. MI6 operates a London station. And London station is home to all sorts of defectors, including several oligarchs. One, I think, is of note, Khodorkovsky. I think he, billionaire, operates an information warfare center on behalf of MI6, closely coordinates with Bellingcat, probably an MI6 asset. So we have that there. Prigozhin's a businessman. There's in addition to the two failed contracts that he lost, that's nearly $2 billion, Ramzan Kadyrov gave a statement where he talked about other business failures on the part of Prigozhin, that he had tried to do certain things. And one of the things that came out is a real estate deal for his daughter in St. Petersburg that went south, that he was expecting to get it and it went south. Real estate in St. Petersburg, on when you get up into the dollars, is a very complicated affair that involves a lot of fingers, a lot of hands, and many of those hands don't reside in St. Petersburg. They reside outside of St. Petersburg, probably in London, and probably controlled by MI6. So here we have Prigozhin, who is sending out all the red flags in the world. I mean, he's already in January, you have foreign intelligence services talking about him talking with Ukrainian intelligence services. Even if that's not true, it came from an official document, which means the intelligence services are talking about. He has red flags going. This is a man whom everybody is aware of now. They're following his businesses. The U.S. has indictments on him. The FBI has a file this thick on him. He's not an unknown person. And so everybody's following. Now, the British, they're going to sit there and say, okay, so what is his primary motivating factor? It appears to be greed. This man likes money. So what do we need to do? We need to create opportunities for him involving money. And then we need to have those opportunities collapse so that he's even more desperate, so that we can then say, hey, we have a really good business opportunity for you if only this happens. So the response would be, but if I do this, what assurances do I have? Which is, we're in contact with Russian politicians. We're in contact with Russian businessmen who have assured us that should Putin fall and you step in, they'll back you. And we understand that you're in contact with all the generals, and you claim that all the generals are on your side secretly. So we think between the two of us, we have this nice little package here. I think Prigozhin thought that when he crossed the line of departure and moved towards Rostov, that he would have Surovikin and Alexeyev, these two generals who gave public statements saying, don't do this. But I think he believed that they would do it. First of all, why did they give statements? Because everybody knows that Prigozhin had been in contact with them in the lead up to this. Prigozhin was calling everybody, begging for intervention. And these guys, of course, being loyal servants of Russia, contacted the intelligence service and said, hey, Prigozhin, talk to us again. And they went, all right, well, just keep talking to him. Keep the line of communication open. Let's find out what he's doing. But when Prigozhin crossed in, they both came out and said, hey, boss, don't do it. Bad move. This is not a good look. And they also appealed to the Wagner soldiers, telling them not to do it. But he also believed that there would be others out there. He believed that there was an entire cadre of combat-hardened Russian leaders or military leaders who were as frustrated as he was with what they call the parquet generals, the generals that live in the shiny offices and never leave for the front lines. There is legitimate. I mean, Prigozhin has a point here. There is a legitimate gripe in the Russian military about a Russian leadership that is removed from the reality of war, oftentimes involved in things other than helping them in war, some corruption, some incompetence. There's legitimate complaints there. But he was hoping that these people, these combat leaders, would rally around him. Didn't happen. And no politicians rallied around him. No businessmen rallied around him. He was isolated. But I think he honestly believed that everything was going to fall in place, that if he just started moving towards Moscow, all of this descent towards Putin that he had manufactured on his own, but he had also hyped up, people fed back saying, we're with you. He thought everybody would come. But it turns out, and this is, again, where McFall and Applebaum are just dead wrong, Putin is an extraordinarily popular leader.
Are you saying British intelligence wanted Prigozhin to step into power or just destabilize Putin?
I think their number one, first of all, I think that everybody understands that Prigozhin could never be in power. Prigozhin would never be the leader and all that. What they wanted was the collapse of Vladimir Putin's government. And then they have handpicked people in London that are prepared to come in and take over. People who, again, the oligarch class, people need to understand when you have corruption, you have criminals, and criminals aren't loyal to the country. They're loyal to money. And Russia is still populated by a tremendous number of criminal oligarchs who resent Putin, resent what he's doing, and would be more than happy to throw their weight behind a new president who promised the lifting of sanctions, who promised them wealth, not wealth for the nation, but personal wealth. And so they would have disposed of Prigozhin that quick because he's a thug. I mean, they throw that word around about Putin all the time. Putin's a thug. Putin ain't a thug. Prigozhin's a thug, straight up thug. With the rap sheet to prove it. So